The train whistle died, leaving only the sound of wind whipping dirt against the station planks. Clara stood shivering in a wool coat, too thin for the territory. "You can send me back," she whispered. Gideon chewed the inside of his cheek. "My boy already chose you." The locomotive spat a final lungful of black coal smoke into the gray afternoon before hauling itself down the tracks. Gideon stood on the edge of the wooden platform, the toes of his grease-stained boots towing the line where the boards met the frozen mud of Oakhaven. The air smelled of sulfur, horse manure, and the sharp, metallic bite of an early frost. He didn't want to be here. Every muscle in his broad, heavy shoulders screamed with the tension of it. He was a man accustomed to the predictable silences of the timberline, not the chaotic, screeching halt of civilization. But winter was 6 weeks away, the trapping season was coming, and he could not leave his son alone in a cabin with a wood stove and a loaded rifle while he ran the lines. He needed a woman, not a wife, just a woman. The agency in St. Louis had cashed his draft and sent a telegram with a date and a time. Through the settling dust of the rail yard, he saw her. She was standing next to a cracked leather valise that looked as though it had been kicked across 3 states. Gideon felt a sour knot pull tight in his gut. The photograph the agency had sent was a lie, or at least a half-truth, heavily massaged by a favorable studio light. The woman in the photograph had possessed a sturdy, wide-hipped constitution. The woman standing before him looked like a strong gust of wind would snap her in two. She wore a faded navy dress with a hem heavy from dried mud. Her coat was a pathetic, thin wool thing, the elbows worn down to the threading. She stood rigidly, her knuckles bone white as they gripped the handle of her bag. Gideon stepped off the platform, his boots crunching in the frozen ruts. Behind his left knee, a small weight pressed against his canvas trousers. Toby. The 6-year-old hadn't said a word since the fever took his mother 3 years ago, but his grip on Gideon's pant leg was a language of its own. As Gideon approached, the woman finally looked up. Her eyes were rimmed with red, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. There was no blush on her cheeks, just the pale, waxy sheen of a traveler who had subsisted on stale bread and bad train water for a week. "Gideon Harper," he said. His voice sounded like 2 stones grating together. He hadn't used it much lately. The woman swallowed hard. The tendons in her thin neck jumped. "I am Clara, Clara Miller." Her voice shook. She smelled of stale sweat, coal ash, and fear. It was the fear that irritated him most. He wasn't a monster, just a tired man with a mountain to survive. He didn't want a weeping, terrified thing in his house. He needed calluses and backbone. He stared at her, assessing the sharp angle of her collarbone, the trembling of her hands. A deeply cynical part of his brain calculated the cost of a return ticket. It would eat into his winter provisions, but keeping a frail woman alive out here might cost him more. Clara saw the calculation in his eyes. She knew that look. It was the look of a buyer finding rot in the apples. She let go of her valise. It hit the mud with a dull, heavy thud. She wrapped her thin arms around her waist, shrinking into herself. The wind howled past the depot, rattling the loose tin on the station roof. "You can send me back," Clara whispered. Her voice was cracked, barely carrying over the wind, but the absolute resignation in it hit Gideon like a physical blow. She wasn't pleading to stay. She was merely accepting her disposal. Before Gideon could formulate a response, the weight vanished from behind his knee. Toby stepped forward. The boy was bundled in an oversized wool coat that smelled of old wood smoke and wet dog. He walked right up to Clara, his small boots splashing in a shallow puddle, splattering dark mud across her already ruined hem. Clara froze. She looked down at the boy. Toby looked up. His face was a map of dirt and half-healed scratches from the briar patches behind the cabin. Slowly, deliberately, Toby reached into his deep pocket. He pulled out a smooth, river-washed quartz stone, his most prized possession, carried every day since he found it in the creek bed last spring. He held his small, dirty hand out toward Clara. Clara let out a shaky breath. She didn't look at Gideon. She ignored the freezing mud and dropped to both knees, putting herself at eye level with the child. She didn't gush. She didn't force a smile. She simply held out her trembling palm. Toby dropped the stone into her hand. Clara curled her fingers over it. "Thank you," she said, her voice dropping its frantic edge, finding a quiet, resonant gravity. It's a very good stone. Toby stared at her for a long second, then reached out and grabbed a fistful of her thin wool coat. He didn't pull, he just held on, anchoring himself clung to her. Gideon watched the exchange, feeling a strange, uncomfortable tightness in his chest. He hated it. He hated the vulnerability of it all. But he looked at his son's small fist, gripping the cheap fabric of Clara's coat, and the cold calculation in his mind vanished, replaced by a heavy, grinding resignation. "I ain't sending you anywhere," Gideon grunted, leaning down to scoop up her heavy valise. He didn't look at her as he hoisted it easily onto his shoulder. "My boy already chose you. Wagons this way." The ride to the ridge took 4 hours. The silence between them was an oppressive, physical thing, broken only by the rhythmic squeal of the wagon's rear axle and the steady clopping of the 2 mules. Clara sat on the hard wooden bench beside Gideon, clutching her coat tight, the quartz stone burning a hole in her pocket. The landscape was brutal. Sprawling plains of dead yellow grass gave way to jagged, towering pines that clawed at the iron-gray sky. It felt like the edge of the world. Gideon drove with loose reins, his forearms resting on his thighs. He exuded heat, a dense animal warmth that Clara subconsciously leaned toward, though she was careful not to let their shoulders touch. She stole glances at him. He was a large man, his face obscured by a thick, unkempt beard, his hands weathered to the texture of cracked saddle leather. There was nothing soft about him. He was terrifyingly capable and completely unreadable. When the wagon finally crested a steep incline and jolted to a halt, the sun was a dying red smear on the horizon. "We're here," Gideon said, looping the reins over the brake lever. Clara looked at her new home. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress against the elements. A low-slung cabin built of massive, unpeeled logs, banked with earth on the north side to block the wind. A plume of thin gray smoke curled from a stone chimney. Gideon hopped down and unhitched the mules with practiced economical movements. He didn't offer a hand to help her down. He expected her to manage, which she preferred. She didn't want his pity. She scrambled down, her knees popping, her boots sinking into the soft blanket of pine needles and dirt. Toby slid out of the wagon bed and immediately ran to the cabin door, waiting. Gideon carried her bag inside. Clara followed. The interior of the cabin was a shock to her senses. It was dark, illuminated only by the dying embers in the hearth. As Gideon struck a match to light a kerosene lamp, the yellow glow revealed a space that was relentlessly functional. There were no curtains, no rugs. Traps hung from the rafters, alongside bundles of dried herbs and salted meat. The air was thick with the smell of lanolin, wood smoke, and something stale like old cooking grease and unwashed wool. The neglect was palpable. It smelled like a home that had lost its heart and kept beating purely out of spite. "I sleep by the fire," Gideon said, pointing to a heavy cot pushed into the corner of the main room. "Toby's got a bed in the alcove. The back room is yours." Clara looked at the heavy timber door he pointed to. A private room. She hadn't expected that. She started, her voice raspy. "I should start supper. The stove." "No," Gideon cut her off, his tone flat. He didn't mean it to be cruel, but he was tired, and watching her try to navigate the dark, unfamiliar cabin was grinding on his nerves. "I'll do it tonight. You just get your things put away." "Mr. Harper, I was hired to work." "I can cook," Clara insisted, stepping toward the cast-iron stove. She needed to prove her usefulness. The terror of being deemed a burden still gripped her throat. She reached for the heavy iron handle of the stove door. "Don't," Gideon warned. Clara's bare fingers clamped down on the iron handle. It was searing hot from the banked coals inside. She gasped, yanking her hand back, a sharp hiss of pain escaping her lips. She clamped her burned hand against her chest, her eyes wide, tears springing instantly to her eyes. Gideon swore under his breath, a low, harsh sound. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't speak softly or ask if she was all right. He grabbed her wrist with one massive, rough hand and dragged her toward the water bucket resting on the dry sink. "Hold still," he barked, grabbing a tin dipper and plunging it into the freezing water. He poured the icy water directly over her burned fingers. Clara gasped again, her whole body rigid, expecting a reprimand, expecting a blow. In her experience, Mistakes were always followed by punishment. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away, bracing for his anger. But the blow never came. Instead, Gideon poured another dipper of water over her hand. His grip on her wrist was tight, too tight, bruisingly strong, but it was steadying. "Cast iron holds heat for 6 hours after the fire dies," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble right next to her ear. It wasn't an insult, it was a statement of fact, a rule for survival. He dropped her wrist and grabbed a semi-clean rag from the counter, roughly patting her hand dry. "Blister's gonna raise. Keep it clean." He turned away immediately, walking back to the stove. He grabbed a heavy leather mitt and yanked the iron door open, throwing 3 logs onto the embers. He didn't look back at her. Clara stood by the dry sink, cradling her throbbing hand. She stared at the broad expanse of his back as he worked. He was brusque, lacking any shred of gentleness. Yet he had caught her mistake before it became severe, and he hadn't struck her. The contradiction confused her deeply. A small tug at her skirt broke her focus. Toby was standing there. He didn't have anything to give her this time. He just pointed a dirty finger toward the back room, then at her bag. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Right," she whispered to the boy. "My things." She picked up her valise with her good hand and walked into the back room. It was freezing, the air stagnant. There was a bed frame built into the wall, a mattress stuffed with straw, and a heavy buffalo robe thrown over it. Nothing else. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the straw crunching loudly underneath her. The cold began to seep through the soles of her boots. She brought her burned hand to her lips, blowing gently on the throbbing red flesh. Outside the thin wooden door, she could hear the heavy thud of Gideon's boots, the clatter of cast-iron pots, and the snapping of the fire. It was an alien symphony. She was hundreds of miles from the life she knew, trapped in the wilderness with a silent child and a man who looked like he could fell a tree with his bare hands. She was terrified, but as she smelled the faint scent of the icy water that lingered on her skin and felt the heavy weight of the quartz stone in her pocket, she realized something else. She was breathing. For the first time in months, the crushing weight of someone else's malice wasn't pressing on her chest. Gideon Harper was a hard, cynical man who didn't want her here. But he had poured the water. Clara lay back on the crinkling straw, pulling the heavy, musky buffalo robe over her shivering body. It smelled like wild earth and blood, and it was the warmest thing she had ever felt. November brought the snow. It did not fall. It assaulted the ridge, a horizontal sheet of ice that sealed the cabin in a suffocating white grip. The world shrank to a single room smelling of boiling pinto beans, wet wool, and the coppery tang of skinned pelts. Clara's hands were ruined. The lye soap ate at her cuticles until they bled, and hauling firewood left dark, yellowing bruises along her forearms. She was perpetually exhausted, her bones aching with a deep, marrow-sucking cold that the stone hearth could never quite chase away. Yet, she did not complain. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy, terrified that a moment of idleness would remind Gideon of how small she was, how ill-suited for this brutal altitude. Gideon watched her. He didn't offer praise. Praise was a useless commodity out here, but he noticed. He noticed that she never flinched from the gore when he dumped a load of skinned muskrats on the table. He noticed the way she mended Toby's socks, pulling the yarn tight with a fierce concentration, her brow furrowed in the lamplight. She was a bundle of raw nerves, flinching whenever a log popped in the fire, or whenever Gideon's heavy boots moved too quickly across the floorboards. She carried old ghosts. He knew the shape of them, even if he didn't know their names. It happened on a Tuesday. The wind was screaming down the chimney, rattling the cast-iron damper. Clara was at the dry sink, hacking at a frozen block of salt pork with a dull cleaver. The meat slipped. The cleaver came down hard, burying itself in the heavy oak of the counter, missing her thumb by a fraction of an inch. Clara froze. The breath seized in her throat. She stared at the blade embedded in the wood, her shoulders hiking up to her ears, bracing for the inevitable explosion. Back in Chicago, ruined meat or a scarred table meant a backhand that would leave her ears ringing for a day. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Heavy footsteps crossed the floorboards. Gideon reached over her shoulder. He smelled of wood smoke, pine pitch, and dried sweat. He wrapped his massive, calloused hand around the handle of the cleaver and wrenched it free from the wood. Clara braced herself, dropping her chin to her chest. Gideon didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his hand. He simply dropped the cleaver into the tin sink with a loud clatter. "Knife's dull," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Dull blade takes more force. More force means you lose control. That's how you lose a finger." Clara opened her eyes, blinking rapidly against the sting of unshed tears. "I'm sorry. I was just trying to." "Don't apologize for gravity, Clara." Gideon reached to his belt and unholstered a long carbon steel hunting knife. The blade was dark, stained with years of use, but the edge gleamed silver. He handed it to her handle first. "Use this. Let the steel do the work, not your shoulder." Clara stared at the handle offered to her. Her hands were shaking as she took it. It was heavy, perfectly balanced. Gideon didn't retreat. He stood beside her, a solid, impenetrable wall of heat. "Cut," he ordered softly. She pressed the blade to the salt pork. It slid through the frozen fat with zero resistance. She exhaled a shaky breath, the tension bleeding out of her spine drop by drop. "Good," Gideon muttered. He didn't look at her face, only at her hands. "I'll sharpen the cleaver tonight." He walked away, pulling his heavy canvas coat off the peg to check the perimeter traps. Clara stood alone at the counter, gripping his hunting knife. The handle was still warm from his body. She looked down at the pale scar on her left hand from the stove her first night. He hadn't hit her, he had armed her. From the corner of the room, Toby sat on his rug, aggressively rubbing two wooden blocks together. He looked up at Clara, his dark eyes solemn, and gave a sharp, singular nod of approval. Clara went back to slicing the meat, a strange, unfamiliar heat blooming in her chest. January broke them down to their foundations. The trapping lines were frozen solid, the game was scarce, and the silence in the cabin grew dense and heavy. Gideon had been gone since dawn. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the snow was falling so thickly that Clara couldn't see the tree line 50 yards away. She paced the length of the cabin, tossing log after log into the stove until the iron belly glowed a dull, angry cherry. Toby sat at the table, drawing circles in spilled flour, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by a restless, twitchy anxiety. He kept looking at the door. By dusk, the temperature plummeted to 30 below. Clara stood by the frosted window, scratching a tiny peephole through the ice with her fingernail. Nothing but swirling, blinding white. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. If Gideon died out there, she and Toby would freeze or starve within 3 weeks. But the panic wasn't just logistical. The thought of Gideon immovable, silent Gideon buried under a snowdrift, made her chest physically ache. At 7 o'clock, the door hinges shrieked. The wind blew the door inward with explosive force, bringing a tidal wave of snow with it. Gideon stumbled over the threshold. He didn't look like a mountain man. He looked like a corpse. His beard was a solid block of ice. His lips were a garly, bloodless blue, and his hands were curled into rigid, frozen claws. He collapsed against the door, using his entire body weight to slam it shut against the gale, then slid down the heavy timber until he hit the floorboards. "Gideon!" Clara rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. He was shaking violently, his teeth clicking together in a terrifying, uncontrollable rhythm. His eyes were glazed. "Toby, blankets, now," Clara barked, her voice stripping away its usual quiet deference, revealing a rusted iron core beneath. She didn't wait for permission. She grabbed the collar of Gideon's frozen canvas coat and yanked. The fabric was stiff as a board. She tore at the frozen leather buttons, snapping 2 of them off, and peeled the coat off his shoulders. She threw his gloves aside and grabbed his bare hands. They were ice cold, the skin a dangerous, waxy white. "Fire!" Gideon slurred, his head rolling back against the logs. "Fell in, the creek, miles back." He had walked 5 miles in wet clothes in a blizzard. The sheer, stubborn will of it was monstrous. Toby dragged the heavy buffalo robe from Clara's bed and dumped it over his father. "Help me get his boots off, Toby," Clara ordered. Together, they wrestled the frozen leather boots off Gideon's feet. Clara stripped off his wet wool socks. She didn't hesitate. She unbuttoned the top of her own dress, pulling the fabric aside to expose the hollow of her collarbone and her chest. She grabbed Gideon's freezing hands and shoved them directly against her bare skin, wrapping her arms tightly over his forearms to trap them there. Gideon gasped at the contact, a shudder violently ripping through his massive frame. His knuckles were rough and calloused against her skin, painfully cold. "You're freezing," he mumbled, trying weakly to pull his hands away. "Don't." "Shut up," Clara hissed, her jaw clenched, leaning her entire body weight into him to share her core heat. "You are not dying on my floor, Gideon Harper. I won't allow it. Do you hear me? I won't." Gideon's eyes fluttered open. The glaze was fading, replaced by a sharp, piercing clarity. He looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the fierce, feral set of her jaw, the way her thin frame shook not from fear, but from the sheer effort of keeping him alive. She wasn't a fragile, broken thing anymore. The mountain hadn't crushed her, it had forged her. He stopped fighting her hold. Instead, his fingers slowly, weakly flexed, pressing against the steady, frantic beat of her heart beneath her collarbone. "Didn't plan on it," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper over the howling wind. They stayed like that for an hour. Toby sat curled against his father's side, wrapped in a quilt, anchoring them both. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent shivering stopped. The color began to creep back into Gideon's lips. The smell of wet wool and melting ice filled the small space, but beneath it, Clara smelled the sharp, familiar scent of him, wood smoke, pine, and life. Gideon shifted, pulling his hands gently from her grip. His fingers brushed the collar of her dress, lingering for a fraction of a second before pulling away. "You're bruised," he noted, his voice rough, pointing a heavy finger at a purple mark on her forearm from hauling wood. Clara looked down at it, then back up at his battered, frost-bitten face. "I heal." Gideon rested the back of his head against the door. He stared at the ceiling, the silence stretching between them, no longer oppressive, but thick with an unspoken truth. "St. Louis," Gideon said suddenly. Clara blinked. "What?" "When you got off that train," Gideon muttered, turning his head to look at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable, yet stripped of all their usual armor. "I figured you'd last a week before the isolation cracked your mind. I figured I'd have to bury you when the ground thawed." Clara swallowed hard, pulling the edges of her dress together. "And what do you figure now?" Gideon reached out. His hand was trembling slightly, a rare vulnerability. He didn't touch her face. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. He pressed it into her palm. Clara looked down. It was a jagged, raw piece of amethyst, purple and unpolished, dug out of the frozen riverbed. It wasn't a ring. It wasn't a promise of an easy life. It was just a piece of the mountain, hard and enduring. "I figure," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a quiet rumble that resonated in her chest. "Toby's got a good eye for people." Clara closed her fist around the rough stone. The sharp edges dug into her palm, a grounding, perfect pain. She looked at the man who had bought her sight unseen, the man who had armed her instead of breaking her. She let out a soft, cracked laugh. "He's a very smart boy." Outside, the wind hurled itself against the heavy logs, but the cabin held firm. The fire snapped in the stove, throwing a warm, golden light over the three of them sitting on the floorboards. Clara leaned her shoulder against Gideon's arm. He didn't flinch. He just leaned back, a heavy, solid weight against the cold. They were two scarred people at the edge of the world, and they were finally warm. The winter was brutal, but the thaw brought something stronger than just survival. Gideon and Clara didn't find a fairy tale romance. They forged a bond out of grit, fire, and a refusal to break. If you felt the cold and the raw truth of their journey, don't leave them behind. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who appreciates a real, grounded romance. Let me know your favorite moment in the comments below.